Hey everyone, it's Anna here, and in this lecture we're going to talk about events. So let's just dive in. First, let's take a look at what an event is. So an event is basically a signal that a thing has happened to an element in our DOM. And if we watch for these signals, then we can run JavaScript code in response to these signals. And a signal can be something like a user action. So basically, events are a way that we can incorporate user interaction into our apps. So when I say a thing has happened to a DOM element, this could be that the user has interacted with the element in one way or another. Events come in many forms, and some of the most common ones are mouse events and keyboard events. So some examples of mouse events are click, double click, and then there's mouse down and mouse up. So mouse down is the start of a click when the mouse is initially pressed, and mouse up represents the end of a click, so when the mouse is released. We also have mouse enter and mouse leave. So if I hover on an element, mouse enter is fired when my cursor enters the element, and mouse leave is fired when my cursor leaves that element. Taking a look at keyboard events, we have key down, key press, and key up. So these are useful, for example, if you're keeping track of arrow key presses, or if you're looking for enter, space, shift, or control keys. In case you're wondering what the difference between key up, key down, and key press is. So key down is when you first press the key up is when you release the key, and key press represents like a character being typed. So on one key down, many key press events may fire. Yeah, and there's plenty of other examples of events, some of which are only available for specific types of elements. I've listed a bunch of examples here. For example, focus happens for an input text box when that text box is focused. Can play is an event for video elements, which is fired when the video is able to be played by the user agent. And I've included a lot of events on these slides, but there are heaps more, and I recommend you take a look at what's available on MDN. Cool, so we know that events are something which raise a signal, but how do we actually listen to that signal? So an event listener is a handler function that runs in case of an event. So basically handlers are a way to run a JavaScript callback to respond to user interaction. Now, how can we actually add an event handler? So there's three main ways of adding an event handler. The first way is here on this slide, and that is to do so using HTML. So here I've got a little HTML snippet for an input button, and I've added an on-click handler, which is an attribute, and I put the JavaScript that I want to run in quotations. So with this example, when this button is clicked, this JavaScript line here will run. So an alert will pop up saying the button is clicked. The second way to do it is to set the property on the DOM element. So when I have an element in JavaScript through getElementById or another method, I can assign a function to element.onClick. So onClick is a property on the DOM object. And this syntax here is just an arrow function, which I'm assigning to onClick, which is basically like a simple lambda or anonymous function. And again, this will alert that the button was clicked when we click it. So a quick quiz, I have this function written here called do something, and then I'm writing element.onClick equals do something. What's wrong with this code? So feel free to pause here for a second if you want to take a second to think about it. So the problem with this code is that I've added parentheses after do something, which means that I'm executing the function, I'm calling it, rather than assigning onClick to the do something function. So the correct answer would be like this, just to remove the parentheses. So the onClick callback, the onClick object on the DOM element is a function. Cool, the final way of adding an event listener is via the function called addEventListener. So this is a function which takes two arguments. The first one is the type of event. So this could be click or mouse move. And the second parameter is the listener, which again is a callback function, just like the last two examples. So once an event listener is added, You can also remove it using remove event listener. So you can see add event listener and remove event listener being used on the last 2 lines on this slide here. And add event listener also takes a third optional options parameter. So options is just an object which specifies some extra settings for the event listener. So some examples of things it takes is an option called once. So if you specify once equals true, this Boolean parameter means that the listener can only be invoked once. So that means it'll automatically remove the listener once it's been invoked. Another option is capture, which is another Boolean parameter which indicates that the event should be captured. So we'll look into a bit later into what this means. And the last example is passive, which is also a Boolean, which when true, it means the function will never call prevent default. And we'll have a look at what prevent default means later in this topic as well. So you can see all the details about add event listener and all the options it accepts on MDN. All right, so we've seen how we can set a function or a callback to be an event listener. Now, event listeners actually have an optional parameter. So this handler, this parameter for the handler is an object of type event. And this object represents all the details relating to the event that has taken place. So here we have a small example of an event listener which is using the event parameter. This code adds a mouse move event listener to the document via add event listener, which will fire when the mouse is moved anywhere on the document. And then in the callback, I'm console logging event.client X and event.client Y. So client X and client Y represent the coordinates of the mouse event. Let me quickly pop into the browser and demo this. All right, let's test that mouse move example in the browser. So I'm going to do document.add event listener. The event I'm listening for is mouse move. And now in this callback, I'm going to console log client X and client Y of the event. All right, I've added the event listener. Now if I try to move my mouse on the document, you can see here that it's console logging the coordinates of my mouse. So if I go all the way to the top left, I get 0, 0, and the Y increases when I go down and the X increases when I go to the right. So what information does this event interface actually contain? So as we saw earlier, there's many different types of events. And there are some properties which are common to all of these events. For example, we have current target, which is the current element that the handler is running on. There's timestamp, which is the time the event was created in milliseconds. And then there's event.type, which is the name of the event, like click. There are also other properties which are specific to types of elements. For example, client X and client Y, which we just saw in the last example, are on mouse events. And for example, key is something which is on keyboard events only, which has the key code of the key that was pressed. Now with our knowledge of events, let's code a small events example using keyboard events. All right, let's do an example with keyboard events. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event listener to the document for the key down event. And I'm going to define a handler function. I'm console logging event.key just to show you guys what key codes are console logged when I press different keys. So running this in the browser on the left, if I press the A key, I get A console logged. If I press B, D, P, then if I press numbers, it also prints the number. If I press a key like an arrow key, I get arrow up, arrow left, arrow right, arrow down, or shift. So basically the key gives us the name of the key which was pressed. Cool. Now I've got a simple HTML page here with a div that I've colored blue and set to 50 by 50 pixels. Now what we're going to do is we're going to write a script, which when I press the arrow keys, it will move the box around the page in the direction of the arrow key which I pressed. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to retrieve the square from the HTML, and I've given it ID square, so I'll use get element by ID. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a function which accepts a left delta and a top delta and moves the square by that amount. So I'll call my function move square. So to move the square's left position, I'm going to use the square.style.left property. So first I'm going to retrieve its current position, then I'm going to add the provided left delta. So I'm going to set square.style.left to current left plus the provided left delta, and then I'm just going to add px at the end. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the top. Now just to test this, when I hit any key, what I want to do is move the square just by 50 pixels. Cool. So if I press that a second time, it moves at 50 more pixels. So our move square function is working. Now what I want to do is I want to check which arrow key was pressed with different left and top values based on the key that was pressed. So I'm going to do a switch statement on event.key. So in the case that the down arrow was pressed, I want to increase the top value by 1 and I want to leave the left value the same. If I'm moving up, I want to decrease the top value by 1. If I'm moving left, I want to increase the left value by 1 and leave the top the same. And if I'm moving right, I want to increase the left value by 1 and leave the top the same. So let's try and run this code. So I'm pressing my right arrow key now and it's moving right. I'm pressing my up arrow key and it's moving up. So it looks like this is working. Let me just quickly increase the amount I'm incrementing by. So now I'm moving 5 pixels at a time. It's moving much faster. So that's our keyboard example done. So now we're going to talk about the event loop. So JavaScript's concurrency model is based on something called the event loop. And the event loop is essentially a message queue which lists messages or events that need to be processed. So when an event gets triggered, it's added to the queue and the page won't run the next event until the current event has reached completion. So we call this the event loop because it resembles something like this loop here. Basically, JavaScript is continuously, synchronously waiting for messages while handling any messages which are currently waiting to be handled. JavaScript's event loop uses something we call a run to completion model. So this means that every message is processed completely before any other message is processed. So the benefit of this is that it's a really simple and easy to understand model that we can often take advantage of when we're writing our JavaScript code. But the downside of this is that since it's synchronous and we have to wait for messages to be completely processed before any other messages are processed, if a single message takes too long to complete, this eats up the main browser thread and the browser won't be able to process anything else, which means that if the browser thread is really busy, we can't even click on elements or scroll on the page because those events aren't being processed. Cool, so that was the event loop. Now let's take a look at event capturing and bubbling. So this is a way of understanding how events are propagated through the DOM. So when a standard DOM event happens, the event goes through 3 phases of propagation. So this diagram shows the event's flow after clicking on a TD tag inside a table. So we've got table tag, body tag, or tbody tag, tr tag, and then td tag. So the first step is the event capturing phase. So the event starts at the highest level, which is the window, and goes down through the document, HTML body, all the way through the different tags until it reaches the target element, which is the TD tag in this case. So that's the capturing phase. The second phase is the target phase, which is when the element has actually reached the target element, the TD element. And then finally, after reaching the target element, this is when it goes through the bubbling phase, which is when the event bubbles up from the element all the way back to the window. So the concept of bubbling is that when an event happens on an element, it first runs the handlers on that element, and then on its parent, and then all the way up its ancestors back to the window. Let's do a quick example which demonstrates event capturing and bubbling. All right, so here I have a sample HTML page where I have 3 nested divs. So I've got my div first, second, and third, and I've applied some styling so that they appear like inside each other and under each other. So I've also quickly added some JavaScript. So in here, I'm calling getElementById to get all 3 squares, and then I've added an on-click listener to each of them. So let me quickly demonstrate what happens when I run this. So if I click first, I get an alert saying first because I've clicked on the first element. Then if I click second, what will happen is the event handler will be called on the target element first, which is our second div, but then it will bubble to the parent, which is first. So let's try that. Cool, so it's alerted second, and now it's also alerting first. And I'll try the same thing with third, so it'll go third, then second, then first, since it's going from the target element to the parent, and all the way up the DOM. Cool, so it's doing third, then second, then first. Now we have a function called stop propagation. So what stop propagation does is it stops the event from bubbling up to its parents. So let me show an example of doing this. So if I add the event object to this listener and do event.stop propagation, then when I click third, it's not going to bubble onto second and first. So it's alerting third, but then it doesn't go on to its parents. So that's all about event bubbling and stop propagation. Now let's take a look at prevent default. So what is prevent default? Basically, some types of DOM elements have default behavior. For example, when you click on an input checkbox, this toggles the checkbox. That's browser default. Images also have default drag and drop behavior to allow you to drag them into another location. And key presses in a text input field have default behavior that when you type, it enters text into the input field. So in our event listeners, we can use this function called prevent default to stop the default behavior happening in the case that we want to stop it. All right, let's do a quick example demonstrating prevent default. All right, so I've got this HTML page, and what I put here is an input checkbox field, which is just a checkbox, and an input text field, which lets me type into it. So like I said before, checkboxes have the default behavior that when you tick it, it gets checked. Text boxes have the default behavior that when you type into them, whatever you type in appears in the text box. So first I'm going to demonstrate prevent default for the checkbox. So I'm going to get this checkbox using getElementById. And now I'm going to add the click event listener to the checkbox. Now in here, I'm going to do event.preventDefault. If I now run this code, when I try to click the checkbox, it's not actually getting checked because I've stopped the default behavior. So if I uncomment this, see, it's working again. Cool. Now let's do a slightly different example for the text box. So first, let me grab the text box by its ID as well. And add an event listener for a key press. So if I do event.preventDefault, it won't let me type in there at all. So let's just quickly show that. So I'm typing and it's not doing anything. Now, what I want to do is I want to allow typing, but I don't want to allow typing of any letters but lowercase characters. So if someone tries to type a number or a symbol, I don't want to allow that. So I'm going to use the charcode attribute of the event to check if what was pressed was a lowercase letter. So I'll be in this if statement if the character is less than a lowercase a, which means, or greater than a lowercase z, which means if it's outside of the lowercase alphabet. And in here, I'm going to do prevent default, and I'll put an alert. So let's try and run this again. So if I type lowercase letters, it's working fine. If I try an uppercase letter, I'm getting an alert saying please use lowercase letters only. There we go. Cool, so that's how to use prevent default. Okay, finally, we're going to do an example which combines all of our knowledge of events, which is a drag and drop basketball game. All right, so let's get started with our basketball drag and drop example. So I've got this HTML page which has two images, a basketball and a hoop. And I've also got this label here which says the score. So right now there's no score. And I've positioned the hoop absolutely far away from the page. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make the ball itself draggable. So I'm going to grab this element from the DOM, and to make it draggable, I'm going to use a combination of three events. I'm going to use mouse down for when the ball is pressed, to mean picking it up. I'm going to use mouse up to mean I've released it, I'm letting go of my drag, and I'm going to use mouse move event. We saw earlier in this video that we can use event client X and client Y to get the position of the mouse. So I'm going to use the mouse move event to position the ball where my mouse is. So first let's get the elements from the DOM. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mouse down and mouse up event listener to the ball. So just now if I try to mouse down on the ball, I get a mouse down console logged. If I mouse up, so I release my mouse, then I get mouse up console logged. Now what I want to do is I want to add a mouse move event listener, but I only want to listen to mouse move if my mouse is currently down. So to do this, I'm going to add my mouse move event listener inside mouse down and remove my mouse move event listener inside mouse up. I'm just removing the event listener using remove event listener like we saw before. Running this again, if I'm moving my mouse on the document, nothing is being console logged. When I mouse down on the ball and start moving my mouse, I get a mouse move event being console logged. Now you'll notice that when I pick up this ball, I'm getting this kind of weird draggy behavior of the ball, but this isn't custom drag and drop. This is actually the default behavior of the browser when you have an image. So what we want to do is we want to prevent the default behavior of dragging this image. So I'm just going to do event.prevent default. So let's try that again. Cool, so that's no longer happening, and you can see mouse move is being console logged. Cool, now what we want to do is we want to change the position of the ball to be the same as the coordinates of the mouse. So to do this, I'm going to change ball.style.left, and I'm going to make this equal to the coordinates of the mouse. And I've done the same with top, set it to client Y. Let's try this. Cool, so now you can see when I mouse down on the ball and move my mouse, it's following my cursor. Now you can see that when I mouse down and I start moving, the ball jumps a little bit. That's because I'm setting the top and left position of the ball to equal my cursor. While what I want to do is I want my cursor to stay on the same position within the ball's element to avoid that jumping when I first pick it up. So to do this, I'm going to calculate the offset of my cursor within the ball element. So to get the offset of the cursor within the ball, I want to get the position of my cursor, and from that, subtract the top left point of the ball's bounding client rectangle. And now I'm going to use this offset and set the left and top of my ball to equal the mouse position, but subtract this offset. So now let's run this again. And now you can see it's no longer jumping. All right, next thing I want to do is I want to make us actually able to score goals in this little game. So I want to make it such that if I drag this over a little hoop graphic, that it will trigger a function which will increment our score. So first thing I want to get is I want to get the coordinates of this little red actual hoop bit from within the image. This is okay to hard code. I grabbed these values earlier, so I'm just going to copy them from here. So these offsets are equal to the offset of the red hoop from the top left corner of the entire hoop image. So let's add some logic to our on mouse move to calculate if our current mouse position is going through this hoop. So let's just keep track of the score in a global variable. First, I want to get the actual position of the hoop. So I'm going to also do this using get bounding client rectangle. I've given the hoop ID hoop. All right, so in this if statement, I'm checking that event.clientX is within the bounds of this red square, which I calculate using the hoop rectangle's bounding client box, so the top and left position of the hoop rectangle, plus these offsets, which I've hard-coded. So I'm just in here, I'm going to console log that a goal was scored. There you go. So you see in my console, goal score is being console logged. Now what we want to do is we want to update the scoreboard to show our new score. So I'm going to get the scoreboard element using its ID. And here I'm going to change scoreboard text content. Okay. Cool, so you can see our score is incrementing, but you probably notice a mistake now that it's incrementing too many times. So since it's triggering on mouse move, as I move over the red portion of the hoop, it's incrementing multiple times. So to fix this, let's just have a Boolean which stores if the score has already incremented in my current movement over the square. So I only want to increment the score if has scored is false. Let's try again. Great, so now you can see it's only incrementing one time per movement through the hoop. Cool, so that's it for our basketball example. And that's also it for this lecture on events. So thanks so much for listening. I hope you learned something.